They threw acid on her uniform at the coffee shop, laughing as the liquid ate through the fabric. What they didn't know was that Lieutenant Commander Rachel Raven Cross was the Navy's most feared interrogator, and in 60 seconds, their world would turn upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast golden streaks across the windows of Café Aurora in downtown Millbrook, a quiet coastal town just outside Naval Base Coronado. It was supposed to be Rachel's day off, a rare moment of peace between deployments where she could blend into civilian life, grab her usual black coffee, and maybe read a book without thinking about classified operations or the weight of national security on her shoulders. At 28, Rachel Cross didn't look like what most people imagine when they heard Navy SEAL. Standing 5'6" with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, she wore civilian clothes, jeans, a plain navy blue t-shirt, and worn leather boots. Her green eyes held a quiet intelligence that most people mistook for gentleness. They couldn't see the years of specialized training, the classified missions, or the psychological warfare techniques that had made her legendary within the SEAL community. Rachel had earned her place in naval special warfare through a combination of exceptional mental fortitude and an almost supernatural ability to read people. While her male counterparts often relied on physical intimidation during interrogations, Rachel had developed techniques that were far more effective and far more feared by enemy combatants. Her methods were so successful that she'd been personally requested for operations in Afghanistan, Syria, and most recently, a classified mission that had prevented a major terrorist attack on American soil. But here in Café Aurora, none of that mattered. Here, she was just another customer waiting for her coffee. The trouble started when 3 men in their early 20s walked in, their voices already raised and aggressive. They wore clothing that suggested they were locals, probably unemployed, definitely looking for trouble. The leader, a tall man with bleached hair and multiple tattoos covering his arms, immediately locked onto Rachel with the kind of predatory stare she'd seen countless times before. "Look what we got here," he announced loudly enough for the entire cafe to hear. Another military princess thinking she's tough. His companions, one stocky with a shaved head, the other thin with nervous energy, flanked him like a pack. The stocky one pointed at the small military-issued backpack Rachel carried. "Bet Daddy bought her way into the Navy," he sneered. "Probably never seen real action." Rachel remained calm, a skill honed through years of high-pressure situations. She'd faced down terrorists, drug cartel leaders, and foreign intelligence operatives. 3 drunk civilians in a coffee shop didn't even register as a threat. She simply turned back to the counter, where the barista, a college-age girl named Amy, was watching the scene with obvious concern. "Don't worry about it," Rachel said quietly to Amy, offering a reassuring smile. "Just the coffee, please." But the men weren't done. The thin one had pulled out his phone and was recording. "Hey, military girl," he called out. "My brother died in Iraq because of people like you. You think you're some kind of hero?" Rachel turned slowly, her expression remaining neutral. In her training, she'd learned to read micro-expressions, voice patterns, and body language. These men weren't grieving veterans or concerned citizens. They were looking for a viral video, hoping to provoke a reaction they could post online. The mention of a dead brother was likely fabricated, a tool to justify their aggression. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said simply, her voice carrying genuine compassion despite her assessment of their motives. This response seemed to frustrate the leader. He'd expected anger, defensiveness, or fear. Rachel's calm demeanor was derailing his script. "Sorry?" He laughed harshly. "You're all the same, pretending to care while you send real Americans to die in your fake wars." The other customers in the cafe were starting to leave, sensing the escalating tension. Amy, the barista, had moved to the back, presumably to call the police. The manager, an older man named Frank, approached cautiously. "Gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you to keep it down or leave," Frank said. His voice shaking slightly, the leader turned on him instantly. "We're not causing trouble, old man. Just having a conversation with our military friend here about her service to our country." Rachel could see the situation deteriorating. In her psychological profile training, she recognized the pattern. These men were building up to something bigger, using verbal aggression to work themselves into a state where they'd justify physical action. The recording suggested they wanted to create a scenario where they could claim self-defense. She began calculating exit strategies, noting the positions of other customers, the distance to the door, and potential improvised weapons if the situation turned violent. It was second nature now. Threat assessment had become as automatic as breathing. "Your coffee, miss," Amy said nervously, returning with Rachel's order. Her hands were shaking as she set the cup on the counter. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Rachel reached for her wallet, but the leader stepped closer, blocking her path to the register. "You know what I think?" he said, his voice dropping to a more menacing tone. "I think you military types think you're better than the rest of us. Walking around in your uniforms, expecting special treatment." "I'm not wearing a uniform," Rachel pointed out calmly. "But you want to, don't you?" The stocky one had moved to her other side, effectively boxing her in. "Probably got one in that little bag of yours." Without warning, he grabbed Rachel's backpack and dumped its contents on the floor. Among her personal items was indeed a folded Navy uniform. She'd been planning to drop it off at the dry cleaners after her coffee run. "Look at that," the leader said with mock surprise. "Our little soldier girl does have her costume with her." The thin one with the phone moved closer, getting a better angle. "This is perfect," he muttered. Military aggression caught on camera. Rachel remained still, watching, calculating. These men had no idea what they were dealing with. In her last interrogation, a Taliban commander, who'd been planning an attack on a school. She'd broken through weeks of resistance in less than an hour using nothing but psychological pressure and tactical empathy. These amateurs were telegraphing their intentions like children. The leader picked up her uniform, holding it by the shoulders. "You know what I think about this?" he asked rhetorically. Then he pulled a small bottle from his pocket, industrial cleaning acid, the kind used for removing graffiti. Without hesitation, he poured it across the fabric of Rachel's dress uniform, the liquid hissing as it ate through the material. The cafe fell silent except for the sound of the acid working. Even the three men seemed momentarily shocked by what they'd done. Destruction of military property was a federal crime, and they just recorded themselves committing it. Rachel looked down at her destroyed uniform, then back up at the three men. Her expression hadn't changed, but something in her eyes had shifted, like ice forming over deep water. "That was a mistake," she said quietly. The leader, perhaps sensing he'd crossed a line he hadn't intended to cross, tried to regain his bravado. "What are you going to do about it, princess? Call your commanding officer?" Rachel smiled then, a small cold expression that didn't reach her eyes. It was the same smile she'd worn when that Taliban commander had finally realized that his interrogator wasn't just another American soldier, but someone who understood exactly how his mind worked and precisely which psychological pressure points would break him. "Actually," Rachel said, her voice taking on a different quality entirely, controlled, professional, predatory. "I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about your motivations and decision-making process." In that moment, the three men began to realize they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. They just didn't know how catastrophic yet. The moment Rachel spoke those words, the atmosphere in Café Aurora shifted like air pressure dropping before a storm. The three men who had seemed so confident seconds earlier now found themselves looking at someone completely different from the quiet woman they thought they'd been intimidating. The leader, who went by the name Tyler Briggs according to the military-style dog tags he wore ironically around his neck, took a half-step backward without realizing it. Something in Rachel's voice had triggered a primal warning system that his conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. His two companions, Danny Tank Rodriguez and Kevin Sketch Morrison, exchanged uncertain glances. Tyler was 24, a high school dropout who'd been rejected from military service due to a combination of criminal record and psychological evaluation red flags. He'd spent the last 3 years nursing a growing resentment against what he saw as an undeserving military establishment, particularly women who he believed were taking opportunities away from real soldiers. His social media was filled with anti-military rhetoric and conspiracy theories about female soldiers being given special treatment. Tank Rodriguez was the muscle of the group, 6'2", 240 pounds, with a history of bar fights and domestic disturbances. He'd been dishonorably discharged from the Marines after 18 months for assaulting a fellow service member. His hatred of the military was more personal. They'd rejected him, labeled him unfit. And now he wanted payback against anyone wearing the uniform. Kevin Morrison, nicknamed Sketch for his twitchy demeanor and artistic pretensions, was the group's social media strategist. 22 years old with film school aspirations, he saw their harassment videos as content that would go viral and launch his career. He was the one still recording, though his hands had started shaking slightly as he sensed the mood change in the room. More detailed conversation? Tyler laughed, but the sound came out forced and hollow. Lady, you're not in whatever little base you came from. This is the real world, and here, Tyler James Briggs. Rachel interrupted quietly, her voice cutting through his bluster like a scalpel. Born March 15, 1999. Arrested twice for vandalism, once for assault. Rejected from Army recruitment in 2018. Currently unemployed and living with your mother on Ocean View Drive. Tyler's face went white. How did you, Daniel Rodriguez, Rachel continued, turning to Tank. Dishonorable discharge from the Marines, currently on probation for assault. 3 restraining orders filed against you by former girlfriends. Her eyes moved to Sketch. And Kevin Morrison, film student dropout with a YouTube channel called Truth Bombers that has exactly 47 subscribers. The 3 men stood frozen, their carefully constructed intimidation routine crumbling as they realized they were dealing with someone who had access to information they'd never shared publicly. What they couldn't know was that Rachel's training included rapid behavioral analysis and cold reading techniques that allowed her to make educated guesses based on micro-details. Tyler's rejection tattoo covering up a military-style design. Tank's nervous habits around authority figures indicating recent legal trouble. Sketch's equipment suggesting amateur content creation, but her psychological warfare training also taught her that perception was more powerful than reality. By presenting information confidently, she could make targets believe she knew far more than she actually did. You see, gentlemen, Rachel said, taking a small step forward while maintaining perfect control of her body language. What you've just done isn't simple harassment. Destroying military property while recording the act for social media distribution could be classified under several federal statutes. But more importantly, she paused, letting her words sink in. You've just committed a crime against someone whose job it is to extract information from people who really don't want to give it up. Tyler tried to regain control of the situation. You're bluffing. You're just some Navy clerk trying to scare us. Rachel's smile widened slightly. Tank, she said, addressing Rodriguez without breaking eye contact with Tyler. Your left hand is trembling. Classic stress response. Your breathing has increased to roughly 22 breaths per minute. up from your resting rate of about 14. You're experiencing what we call fight or flight activation, which is interesting because your conscious mind hasn't fully processed the threat yet. Tank looked down at his hand in shock. It was indeed shaking. And Sketch, Rachel continued, still not turning away from Tyler, your grip on that phone has tightened significantly. You're unconsciously seeking comfort from a familiar object because your amygdala is screaming that something is very wrong here. Tell me, are you still recording? Because everything you capture from this point forward could be used as evidence in federal court. Kevin's thumb moved instinctively toward the stop button. Don't, Rachel said calmly. Keep recording. I want there to be a complete record of what happens next. Frank, the cafe manager, had returned from calling the police and was watching the scene unfold with growing alarm. The few remaining customers had pressed themselves against the far wall. Sensing that whatever was happening was far beyond a simple argument, Tyler, realizing his companions were wavering, decided to escalate. Look, military princess, I don't know what kind of head games you think you're playing. But, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Cross, she interrupted, her voice taking on an official tone that seemed to fill the small space. Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Psychological Operations Specialist, Interrogation Division. The words hit Tyler like physical blows. Naval Special Warfare Development Group, SEAL, Team 6. Even someone with Tyler's limited military knowledge knew what that meant. Tank took another step backward. Sketchman, maybe we should. No, Tyler snapped, his voice rising with desperation. She's lying. There's no way. Look at her, she's tiny. She's probably some secretary trying to scare us with big words. But even as he said it, Tyler was remembering details that suddenly took on new meaning. The way Rachel moved with perfect balance and control. The complete lack of fear in her eyes, even when outnumbered 3-1. The casual confidence with which she'd read their personal information. Most tellingly, the fact that she hadn't backed down an inch despite being surrounded. Rachel opened her backpack, the same bag they'd dumped on the floor, and pulled out a leather wallet. She flipped it open to reveal her military identification, then set it on the counter where they could all see it. The ID was real. The photo matched. The rank was clearly visible, Lieutenant Commander. And stamped across the top in bold letters, Classified Clearance Level. Now, Rachel said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper while maintaining perfect clarity. Let's talk about your options. Option 1. You can continue down this path. In which case I'll be forced to treat this as a national security incident, involving the destruction of classified military property and harassment of a special operations officer. That would involve federal investigators, terrorism task force interviews, and background checks that would uncover every illegal thing you've done in the past 5 years. She paused, letting them absorb that information. Option 2. You can apologize. Compensate me for the destroyed uniform and delete that video. In exchange, I'll treat this as a simple misunderstanding between civilians and a service member. Tyler's mind was racing. Everything about this situation had spiraled beyond his control. What was supposed to be easy content for their harassment videos had turned into a potential federal case. But his pride and anger wouldn't let him back down completely. You can't prove anything, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We didn't know it was classified. We're just patriots exercising our First Amendment rights. Rachel nodded slowly, as if considering his words. That's certainly one interpretation. Of course, the interesting thing about my particular specialty is that I don't actually need you to confess to anything. I can usually tell what people are thinking just by observing their stress responses. She gestured toward Tank, whose face had gone pale. Your friend there is experiencing what we call cognitive dissonance. Part of him wants to fight because that's his default response to feeling cornered. But his survival instincts are telling him that would be a very Very bad idea. Tank nodded involuntarily, then caught himself and tried to look tough again. And Sketch is calculating whether the potential viral video is worth facing federal charges. The answer, by the way, is no. Kevin's phone was now pointing toward the floor. The three men found themselves caught in a trap they'd built themselves. They'd come looking for an easy target to bully and intimidate, but had instead cornered one of the most dangerous people in the American military, someone specifically trained to break down psychological defenses and extract compliance from unwilling subjects. And Rachel was just getting started. The tense standoff in Café Aurora was interrupted by the arrival of someone who would change everything. Through the glass doors walked Master Chief Petty Officer Samuel Iron Mike Harrison, a man whose reputation preceded him into any room he entered. At 52, Harrison was a living legend in the SEAL community, a veteran of Panama, Desert Storm, Somalia, and 3 tours each in Iraq and Afghanistan. Harrison stood 6'4" with graying temples and scars that told stories of battles fought in places that didn't officially exist. His presence was magnetic in the way that only comes from decades of leading men through impossible situations. More importantly for Rachel's current predicament, Harrison had been her mentor, training officer, and the man who'd shaped her into the psychological warfare specialist she'd become. He'd been driving through Millbrook on his way to a classified briefing at the nearby Riverside Naval Intelligence Center when he'd noticed the small crowd gathered outside Café Aurora and the police cars just arriving. His trained eye had immediately spotted potential trouble, and when he glimpsed Rachel through the window surrounded by 3 agitated men, his protective instincts kicked in. Well, Harrison said as he stepped inside, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect in the most dangerous corners of the world. What do we have here? The 3 men turned toward this new arrival, and Tyler immediately sensed another threat. Harrison wasn't in uniform, wearing instead civilian clothes that couldn't hide his military bearing. Everything about him screamed special operations, from the way he moved to the unconscious command presence that filled the space. This doesn't concern you, old man, Tyler said, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his amusement at being called old man by someone who'd probably never faced anything more dangerous than a traffic stop. Actually, son, when civilians threaten one of my former students, it becomes very much my concern. Rachel felt a wave of relief mixed with professional respect. Harrison's timing was perfect, but more than that, his presence added a crucial element to the psychological pressure she'd been applying. Where she represented the intellectual, analytical side of special operations, Harrison embodied the combat veteran mystique that even anti-military civilians couldn't ignore. Master Chief, Rachel acknowledged with a slight nod, maintaining her professional demeanor while letting Tyler and his friends absorb the implications of Harrison's rank and obvious relationship to her. Lieutenant Commander, Harrison replied formally, then shifted his attention to the destroyed uniform on the floor. His expression darkened as he took in the acid-damaged fabric and the small bottle still in Tyler's hand. Want to explain why there's a destroyed Navy uniform on the floor and why these gentlemen seem to think threatening a SEAL officer is a good idea? Tank Rodriguez, already nervous, found himself facing down another military figure who radiated the kind of danger he'd only encountered once before, during his brief and unsuccessful Marine career. The man who'd gotten him dishonorably discharged had possessed the same aura of controlled violence, and seeing it again triggered uncomfortable memories of how badly that confrontation had ended for him. Look, we didn't know, Tank started to say, his earlier bravado evaporating. Didn't know what? Harrison's voice remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. Didn't know that destroying military property is a federal crime? Didn't know that harassment of service members is prosecutable under the Uniform Code of Military Justice? Or didn't know that you were dealing with someone who spent the last 5 years breaking enemy operatives, who were a hell of a lot tougher than you three? Kevin Morrison, still holding his phone but no longer recording, found himself the focus of Harrison's attention. You must be the videographer. Tell me, son, what exactly were you planning to do with footage of 3 civilians assaulting a Navy officer? We weren't assaulting anyone, Kevin protested weakly. We were just talking. Harrison gestured toward the ruined uniform. That's what you call talking? In my day, we had a different word for destroying someone else's property. Tyler, realizing that the situation was spiraling completely out of his control, decided to make one last desperate play. You can't intimidate us. We know our rights. This is America, and we have freedom of speech. Absolutely, Harrison agreed pleasantly. Freedom of speech is a beautiful thing. Of course, freedom of speech doesn't protect you from the consequences of criminal actions. And it certainly doesn't protect you from the psychological evaluation that follows when you threaten special operations personnel. Rachel watched the interplay with professional interest. Harrison was using a technique they'd both learned in advanced interrogation training, the good cop, bad cop dynamic, but with a sophisticated twist, where she'd been applying precise psychological pressure. Harrison was adding the weight of institutional authority and the implied threat of military justice, but more than tactical considerations. Harrison's arrival had triggered a flood of memories for Rachel. He'd been the one to recognize her unique talents during basic training, steering her away from conventional military roles toward the specialized psychological operations that had become her calling. When other instructors had doubted whether a woman could handle the mental demands of interrogation work, Harrison had become her advocate and protector. You know, Harrison continued, addressing all 3 men but keeping his eyes on Tyler, in my 30 years of military service, I've seen a lot of tough guys. Real tough guys. The kind who volunteer for missions they know they might not come back from. The kind who carry their wounded teammates out of firefights. The kind who refuse to break under torture. He paused, letting his words sink in. And in all that time, I've never met a truly tough person who needed to gang up 3-on-1 against a woman half their size to prove their point. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Tyler's entire worldview was built around the fantasy that he was tougher and more capable than the military personnel who'd rejected him. Harrison had just systematically dismantled that self-image with surgical precision. Tank shuffled his feet nervously, clearly wanting to leave but afraid that running would make things worse. Kevin had stopped recording entirely and was staring at the floor. Master Chief, Rachel said, stepping back into the conversation, these gentlemen were just explaining their motivation for destroying federal property. I believe Mr. Briggs mentioned something about patriotism and First Amendment rights. Harrison nodded gravely. Patriotism. That's interesting. Tell me, Mr. Briggs, what exactly do you think patriots do? Because in my experience, patriots don't usually destroy the uniforms that represent their country. Tyler's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. The military doesn't represent my country. It represents corporate interests and foreign wars that kill Americans for oil money. Ah, Harrison said, his voice taking on a tone of understanding that was somehow more menacing than anger. So you're not anti-military because of personal resentment. You're anti-military because of principled political beliefs. That's actually much more interesting. Rachel recognized the technique immediately. Harrison was setting up a logical trap, appearing to validate Tyler's position while actually preparing to demolish it. Tell me about these beliefs, Harrison continued. When did you develop them? Was it before or after you were rejected from military service? The question hit Tyler like a physical blow. His political rhetoric had been exposed as a rationalization for personal failure, and everyone in the cafe could see it. But Harrison wasn't finished. And this principled political stance, does it extend to respecting the rights of individual service members? Or just to destroying their property and filming it for social media? Frank, the cafe manager, had been watching the exchange with growing fascination. As a Vietnam veteran himself, he recognized the tactical brilliance of what was happening. Two highly trained military professionals were systematically dismantling three bullies using nothing but words and psychological pressure. The police officers who'd arrived were also watching through the window. But their supervisor, a former Marine, had recognized both Rachel and Harrison and advised his team to let the situation play out unless violence actually erupted. Tyler realized he was trapped. Every response he could think of would either admit personal failure or expose the hollowness of his political justifications. His companions had essentially abandoned him, leaving him to face down two special operations veterans alone. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "People like you get all the respect and benefits while real Americans struggle. You think you're heroes, but you're just government tools." Harrison nodded slowly, as if considering this perspective seriously. "You're absolutely right about one thing," he said. "We are tools. Specifically, we're tools designed to break things that threaten American citizens. The question is, are you something that threatens American citizens?" The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Tyler had crossed a line from civilian criticism into criminal behavior. And now he was facing the consequences of that choice. Rachel stepped forward slightly, her voice returning to the clinical tone she used in interrogation sessions. "Mr. Briggs, you're experiencing what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. Your brain is trying to reconcile the reality of your situation with the story you've told yourself about your own capabilities. The good news is that this is a normal human response to stress. The bad news is that it typically gets worse before it gets better." Tyler looked around the cafe desperately, seeking some escape from the psychological pressure being applied by two people who'd been trained to break much stronger opponents than him. But there was nowhere to run, and his companions had clearly abandoned him to save themselves. The web of justification and bravado he'd constructed was crumbling, leaving him face to face with the truth about what he'd become and what he'd done. And Rachel and Harrison were just getting started with their lesson in consequences. The entrance of Master Chief Harrison had fundamentally shifted the power dynamic in Café Aurora. But what happened next would establish the rules of engagement that would govern everything that followed. Rachel stepped forward, her movements deliberate and controlled, positioning herself where she could address not just Tyler and his companions, but the growing audience of police officers, cafe staff, and the few remaining customers who had become unwitting witnesses to an escalating confrontation. "Gentlemen," Rachel began, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to briefing rooms where lives hung in the balance. "What we have here is a situation that can resolve in several different ways. I'm going to explain those options clearly so there's no confusion about what happens next." She gestured toward the ruined uniform on the floor, the acid still eating through patches of fabric. "Option 1. We treat this as a hate crime against military personnel, which under the Matthew Shepard Act can carry federal charges with sentences up to 10 years. The video evidence your friend recorded would make prosecution straightforward." Kevin Morrison's face went pale as he realized his phone contained evidence that could send all three of them to federal prison. He looked desperately at Tyler, hoping for guidance. But Tyler was staring fixedly at Rachel, his earlier bravado replaced by the dawning realization that he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. "Option 2, Rachel continued. "We classify this as destruction of classified military property. That uniform contains fabric treatments and identification markers that are considered sensitive materials. Destroying them while recording the act could be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Master Chief Harrison nodded approvingly at Rachel's tactical approach. She was systematically laying out the legal framework that would govern their situation, removing any ambiguity about consequences while still leaving room for de-escalation. It was a textbook example of the psychological operations techniques he'd taught her years earlier. "Now," Rachel said, her tone shifting slightly towards something that might have been compassion if not for the steel underneath, "there is a third option. We treat this as a misunderstanding between citizens and military personnel. One that can be resolved through appropriate compensation and acknowledgement of wrongdoing." Frank, the cafe manager, found himself inadvertently holding his breath. As a Vietnam veteran, he recognized the precision with which Rachel was dismantling her opponent's position while still offering them a path to avoid complete destruction. It reminded him of the psychological operations specialists he'd worked with in Saigon, people who could convince enemy operatives to surrender without firing a shot. Tyler's two companions were clearly hoping he would choose the third option. But Tyler himself was trapped between his wounded pride and his growing understanding of the serious legal jeopardy he faced. The anti-military rhetoric that had sustained his self-image for years was crumbling under the weight of real consequences. "There's something else you need to understand," Harrison interjected, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in special operations. "Lieutenant Commander Cross isn't just any Navy officer. She's part of a very small, very specialized community of people who've been trained to handle the most dangerous situations our country faces." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "The reason that matters isn't because she's physically dangerous to you, though she certainly is. It's because harassing someone with her clearance level triggers automatic security reviews that involve federal agencies you've probably never heard of." Tank Rodriguez, who had been growing increasingly nervous throughout the confrontation, finally found his voice. "Look, man, maybe we should just apologize and get out of here. This has gotten way too heavy." Tyler spun toward his companion with fury. "Don't you dare back down now. These military types think they can intimidate real Americans, but we have rights." You have the right to remain silent," interrupted Officer Patricia Williams as she stepped through the cafe door, her badge clearly visible on her belt. Williams was a 20-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department and a former military police officer who had immediately recognized the volatile nature of the situation from outside. "You also have the right to an attorney, and frankly, gentlemen, I'd recommend exercising that right very soon." Rachel turned toward the officer with professional courtesy. "Officer Williams, I'm Lieutenant Commander Rachel Cross, Naval Special Warfare. These individuals have destroyed military property and recorded themselves doing it. I'm prepared to file a formal complaint, but I wanted to give them an opportunity to resolve this civilly first." Williams nodded, her expression indicating she was familiar with military protocols for handling civilian incidents. "I appreciate that, Commander. We've been monitoring the situation from outside. Would you like to explain what happened here?" Rachel provided a concise factual account of the events, from the initial harassment through the destruction of her uniform. Her delivery was clinical and professional, focusing on actions and evidence rather than emotions or speculation about motives. It was exactly the kind of testimony that would hold up in court, and everyone present knew it. "And the video evidence?" Williams asked, looking pointedly at Kevin Morrison. Kevin looked at Tyler desperately, but Tyler was staring at the floor, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. The reality of facing federal charges was sinking in, replacing his earlier anger with something approaching panic. I recorded some of it," Kevin admitted quietly. "But I can delete it if ... "No," Rachel said firmly. "Don't delete anything. That video is now evidence in a potential federal case. Tampering with it would add obstruction of justice charges to your current legal problems. Harrison stepped forward, addressing Officer Williams directly. Patricia, I've known Commander Cross for 8 years. She's one of the most professional officers I've ever served with. If she says these men committed a crime, you can trust that assessment completely. Williams nodded. She'd worked with military personnel throughout her career and understood the significance of Harrison's endorsement. Commander Cross, how would you like to proceed? Do you want to press charges immediately, or would you prefer to give these gentlemen a chance to make this right? Rachel looked at the 3 men, her psychological training allowing her to read their stress levels and decision-making processes with clinical precision. Tyler was experiencing what interrogators called reality shock, the moment when a suspect's fantasy version of their situation collapsed under the weight of actual consequences. Tank was in pure survival mode, ready to do whatever was necessary to minimize his legal exposure. Kevin was caught between loyalty to his friends and terror of federal prison. I'm prepared to accept the third option I outlined, Rachel said finally. Full compensation for the destroyed uniform, a written apology acknowledging wrongdoing, and deletion of any social media posts related to anti-military harassment. In exchange, I'll treat this as a civil matter rather than a criminal one. Tyler looked up sharply. How much compensation? A dress uniform with all appropriate insignia and decorations costs approximately $1,200. Rachel replied. Plus cleaning costs for the items that were contaminated when you poured acid in my vicinity. Call it $1,500 total. Tyler's face went red. $1,500? For one uniform? That's insane. Harrison's voice cut through Tyler's protest like a blade. Son, let me explain something to you about perspective. $1,500 is what you'll pay if you're smart enough to accept Commander Cross's generous offer. If you choose to fight this in federal court, you'll be looking at legal fees starting around $50,000, plus potential fines, plus prison time, plus a federal conviction on your record that will follow you for the rest of your life. Officer Williams nodded in agreement. I've seen federal prosecutions for destruction of military property. The government doesn't mess around with these cases. Commander Cross is offering you a gift. The chance to walk away from this with nothing more than a financial penalty and a bruised ego. Frank, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, stepped forward. If it helps, he said, addressing Tyler directly, I'll testify that you seemed genuinely remorseful once you understood the seriousness of what you'd done. That might help if this does go to court. The offer surprised everyone, including Rachel. Frank was essentially offering Tyler a character reference despite having witnessed the entire confrontation. It was an act of grace that spoke to the older veterans' understanding of how quickly young men could destroy their lives through poor decisions. Tyler found himself at a crossroads that would determine the trajectory of his future. He could accept responsibility, pay the financial penalty, and walk away with the expensive lesson learned. Or he could let his pride drive him toward a federal prosecution that would almost certainly destroy any chance he had of rebuilding his life. Rachel waited patiently for his decision, her training having taught her that the most important moments in any interrogation were often the silences, when subjects wrestled with choices that would define their futures. She had given Tyler and his companions all the information they needed to make an informed decision. What happened next would reveal who they truly were beneath the bluster and bravado. The cafe had become a courtroom where the only judge was consequence, and the verdict was entirely in Tyler's hands. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Tyler finally spoke, his voice stripped of its earlier aggression. Fine, I'll pay the $1,500. But I want it on record that I think this is extortion. Officer Williams immediately stepped forward. Mr. Briggs, I'm going to stop you right there. Anything else you say could be used against you if this becomes a criminal matter. I strongly suggest you accept Commander Cross's offer and keep any additional opinions to yourself." Rachel remained perfectly calm. But Harrison noticed the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated Tyler had just made another serious tactical error. By claiming extortion, he'd essentially rejected the civil resolution she'd offered and opened himself to renewed criminal liability. "Actually," Rachel said, her voice taking on the clinical tone that anyone who knew her recognized as dangerous, "Mr. Briggs just made an accusation of criminal conduct against a federal officer. That changes the situation significantly." Tank Rodriguez grabbed Tyler's arm desperately. "Dude, shut up. Just shut up and pay the money." But Tyler's pride had been wounded beyond his ability to think rationally. The woman he'd intended to humiliate was dictating terms to him, and his entire worldview couldn't accept that reality. "I'm not paying anything to some desk jockey who thinks her uniform makes her special. You want your money? Take me to court." Master Chief Harrison exchanged a look with Rachel that contained volumes of communication, developed over years of working together in high-stress situations. Tyler had just chosen the hard path, and both special operations veterans knew that some lessons could only be learned through painful experience. "Very well," Rachel said formally. "Officer Williams, I'd like to file formal charges for destruction of federal property, harassment of military personnel, and now false accusation against a federal officer. I'll also be requesting that the FBI investigate this as a potential hate crime, given the targeting of military personnel and the premeditated nature of the video recording." Kevin Morrison, who had been growing increasingly panicked throughout the confrontation, finally broke. "Tyler, man, this is insane. Just apologize and pay the money. I can't go to federal prison. I've got a scholarship interview next week. You should have thought about that before you decided to film yourself committing federal crimes," Harrison observed dryly. "Actions have consequences, son. That's a lesson your friend Tyler is apparently determined to learn the hard way." Officer Williams had been taking notes throughout the exchange, and now she looked up with the expression of someone who'd seen too many young men destroy their futures through pride and stupidity. "Commander Cross, are you certain you want to pursue federal charges? Once I file this report, it's out of my hands. The U.S. Attorney's Office will make the prosecution decisions." Rachel nodded firmly. "I gave Mr. Briggs every opportunity to resolve this matter civilly. He's made his choice clear." Frank, the cafe manager, shook his head sadly. As a veteran himself, he understood the weight of what was happening. Federal charges would follow Tyler for the rest of his life, affecting his ability to get jobs, housing, or credit. It seemed like a disproportionate consequence for what had started as drunken harassment. But Tyler's continued defiance had escalated the situation beyond redemption. Tank Rodriguez made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Look, Commander, Tyler's just scared and saying stupid things. We all are. Can't we work something out? I mean, nobody got physically hurt, right?" Rachel turned to Tank with the expression she reserved for terrorist operatives who thought they could negotiate their way out of consequences. "Mr. Rodriguez, you were dishonorably discharged from the Marines. You know exactly how military justice works. You also know that conspiracy to commit federal crimes carries the same penalties as actually committing them. Your participation in planning and recording this incident makes you equally liable." Tank's face went ashen as he realized that his own military background had just become another weapon in Rachel's psychological arsenal. She wasn't just prosecuting Tyler. She was systematically dismantling all three of their lives with surgical precision. Kevin Morrison was now openly crying, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his earlier bravado. "Please, I just filmed it. I didn't know they were going to destroy anything. I thought it was just going to be talking." "Premeditation," Harrison observed clinically. "The fact that you brought recording equipment suggests you planned to document whatever happened. That makes it conspiracy rather than a spontaneous incident." Rachel pulled out her phone and began dialing. FBI tip line. This is Lieutenant Commander Rachel Cross, Naval Special Warfare. I need to report a hate crime against military personnel with video evidence and multiple witnesses. The reality of federal law enforcement involvement hit the three men like a physical blow. Tyler, who had been defiant moments earlier, suddenly looked like he was going to vomit. The FBI wasn't local police who might be willing to work out a deal. The FBI was serious investigators who would tear apart their entire lives looking for evidence. Officer Williams stepped forward to take control of the immediate situation. Gentlemen, I'm going to need you to remain here while we sort this out. Commander Cross, how long before federal agents arrive? They said approximately 30 minutes, Rachel replied, ending her call. They're sending a team from the Domestic Terrorism Task Force since this involves targeted harassment of military personnel with recorded evidence of premeditation. Tyler finally broke completely. Domestic terrorism? We're not terrorists. We're Americans. Americans who planned and executed an attack on military personnel while recording it for distribution, Rachel corrected. The method might be different from traditional terrorism, but the intent to intimidate through violence against specific populations fits the legal definition perfectly. Harrison nodded approvingly at Rachel's tactical use of legal terminology. She was systematically deconstructing any potential defense arguments by establishing the criminal framework that would govern prosecution. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that had made her so effective in interrogation situations. Tank Rodriguez, whose military experience gave him some understanding of how investigations worked, made a final desperate plea. Commander Cross, please. Tyler's an idiot, but he's not evil. Can't you show some mercy here? We'll do anything to make this right. Rachel studied Tank with the analytical gaze she used to assess enemy operatives. Mr. Rodriguez, mercy is what I offered when I gave you the option to resolve this civilly. Mr. Briggs rejected that mercy and chose to escalate to criminal accusations against me. Now you're asking for mercy again after participating in a planned attack on military personnel. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. In my professional experience, people who ask for mercy after rejecting it when it was freely offered aren't actually seeking redemption. They're seeking to avoid consequences while maintaining the attitudes that led to their behavior in the first place. Kevin Norrison looked around desperately, seeking some escape from the consequences of his decisions. But there was nowhere to run. The video evidence was on his phone. Multiple witnesses had observed the entire incident, and federal investigators were already en route. Frank approached Officer Williams quietly. Patricia, is there really nothing that can be done? I mean, yes, they're idiots and what they did was wrong, but ruining their lives seems... Williams shook her head. Frank, I appreciate your compassion, but they had their chance. Commander Cross offered them a reasonable resolution, and they rejected it. Once federal charges are filed, it's out of our hands. The cafe had become a holding area where three young men waited for their futures to be determined by investigators who specialized in threats against national security. What had started as casual harassment had escalated into a federal case that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Rachel and Harrison stood together near the window, their professional demeanor unchanged despite the chaos they'd unleashed with nothing more than psychological pressure and legal knowledge. They represented everything Tyler had thought he was rebelling against, but they'd proven to be far more formidable opponents than he'd ever imagined. In 30 minutes, when the federal agents arrived, Tyler Briggs, Tank Rodriguez, and Kevin Morrison would discover what it meant to face the full weight of American military justice. Their choice to reject mercy would define the rest of their lives. The arrival of the FBI transformed Café Aurora from a simple coffee shop into what resembled a crime scene processing center. Special Agent Diana Reeves stepped through the door at exactly 11:47 a.m. her professional demeanor immediately commanding attention from everyone present. Behind her came Agent Marcus Thompson, a specialist in domestic terrorism cases, and Agent Sarah Kim from the Bureau's Military Liaison Division. Reeves was a 15-year veteran of the FBI who had worked everything from organized crime to international terrorism. At 42, she had developed the kind of analytical mind that could quickly assess complex situations and identify the key players and motivations involved. Her presence immediately elevated the incident from a local disturbance to a federal investigation. Lieutenant Commander Cross, Agent Reeves approached Rachel with professional courtesy. "I'm Special Agent Reeves, FBI. We spoke on the phone. Can you walk me through what happened here?" Rachel provided a concise, chronological account of the events. From the initial harassment through Tyler's final refusal to accept civil resolution, her military training showed in the precise, factual nature of her report, focusing on observable actions rather than speculation about motives or emotional responses. Agent Thompson had immediately focused on Kevin Morrison and his phone, recognizing the critical importance of preserving video evidence before it could be deleted or corrupted. "Sir, I need you to power down your device and hand it over. This is now evidence in a federal investigation." Kevin's hands shook as he complied, the reality of FBI involvement finally penetrating his earlier denial about the seriousness of the situation. The phone that had been his tool for creating viral content had become the instrument of his potential destruction. Tyler Briggs stood frozen, watching federal agents systematically document and process what he'd convinced himself was just a prank gone wrong. The appearance of Agent Kim from the Military Liaison Division particularly unnerved him, as it suggested the FBI took threats against military personnel seriously enough to maintain specialized personnel for such cases. "Mr. Briggs," Agent Reeves addressed Tyler directly, "you have the right to remain silent, and I strongly recommend you exercise that right until you've consulted with an attorney. However, I want to make sure you understand the potential charges you're facing." She pulled out a small notebook and began reading from it with clinical precision. "Destruction of federal property, harassment of military personnel, conspiracy to commit hate crimes, and based on your statements to local police, potentially false accusations against a federal officer. These charges carry combined maximum sentences of up to 25 years in federal prison." Tank Rodriguez, who had been hoping his cooperation might earn him some consideration, felt his last hopes evaporate. His dishonorable discharge from the Marines had already limited his employment prospects, and now he was facing federal charges that would make him essentially unemployable in any legitimate profession. Master Chief Harrison observed the federal agent's methodology with professional interest. Agent Kim approached him with the respectful demeanor that one professional showed another, clearly recognizing his rank and experience level. "Master Chief Harrison, I understand you arrived during the incident. Can you provide your assessment of the situation when you entered?" Harrison's account was similarly precise and professional, but he added context that only someone with decades of military experience could provide. Agent Kim: "What struck me immediately was the premeditated nature of the harassment. These weren't drunk college kids making poor decisions. This was planned intimidation of military personnel with recording equipment prepared to document and distribute the results." Agent Thompson had been examining the destroyed uniform, taking photographs, and collecting samples of the acid-damaged fabric. "Commander Cross, this uniform contained classified identification markers, standard DevGru insignia and deployment patches." Rachel confirmed. "Nothing above secret classification, but the fabric treatments and some of the identification codes are considered sensitive." Agent Reeves made notes about the classification issues, which would add additional charges related to destruction of classified materials. Even though the classification level was relatively low, federal prosecutors took any compromise of military security information seriously. Frank, the cafe manager, found himself being interviewed by Agent Kim about what he'd observed. His status as a Vietnam veteran gave his testimony additional credibility, and his willingness to describe Tyler's behavior as escalating and aggressive would be valuable in establishing the pattern of premeditated harassment. "They came in looking for trouble," Frank told Agent Kim. "This wasn't spontaneous. Tyler Briggs was specifically targeting the commander because she was military, and his friends were ready with recording equipment. They knew exactly what they were doing." Officer Williams provided the local police perspective, emphasizing Rachel's attempts to resolve the situation civilly and Tyler's repeated rejection of reasonable settlement offers. Her 20 years of law enforcement experience lent weight to her assessment that the federal charges were appropriate given Tyler's continued escalation. Agent Reeves turned back to Tyler, who was now visibly sweating despite the cool morning air. "Mr. Briggs, I'm curious about something. You mentioned that your brother died in Iraq. Our preliminary background check doesn't show any deceased siblings in your family. Would you like to explain that discrepancy?" Tyler's face went white as he realized the FBI had already begun investigating his background and had discovered his lie about having a dead brother. The fabricated justification he'd used to rationalize his anti-military harassment had just become evidence of his willingness to manipulate and deceive. It was my friend's brother," Tyler stammered. "I misspoke." "You misspoke about having a dead sibling?" Agent Thompson interjected. "That's quite a significant mistake, Mr. Briggs. It suggests you were fabricating personal trauma to justify harassing military personnel." Rachel watched the interrogation with professional interest, noting the techniques the federal agents used and how they compared to her own specialized training. The FBI agents were methodical and thorough, but they lacked the psychological warfare expertise that made her so effective in breaking down enemy operatives. Agent Kim had moved on to interviewing Kevin Morrison, whose earlier tears had evolved into full panic as he understood the scope of the investigation that would now examine every aspect of his life. "Mr. Morrison, your YouTube channel Truth Bombers contains several videos critical of military personnel. Is harassment of service members a regular activity for your group?" Kevin realized that his entire online presence was now evidence in a federal case. Videos he'd thought were edgy political commentary would be analyzed as evidence of premeditated bias against military personnel. His dreams of film school and a career in media were evaporating in real time. Tank Rodriguez attempted one final desperate gambit. "Agent Reeves, I served in the Marines. I know I messed up, but I'm not anti-military. This whole thing got out of hand, but I respect the service." Agent Reeves consulted her notes. "Mr. Rodriguez, you were dishonorably discharged for assault on a fellow Marine. Your service record indicates problems with authority and violent behavior toward other service members. Your current actions seem consistent with that pattern." Tank's military service, which he'd hoped might earn him some consideration, had instead become additional evidence of his unsuitability for society and his pattern of violence against military personnel. Agent Thompson finished processing the video evidence and turned to Agent Reeves. "The recording clearly shows premeditated harassment, destruction of federal property, and conspiracy among all three subjects. We have enough evidence for federal charges on all counts." Rachel stepped forward to address Agent Reeves directly. "Agent Reeves, I want to be clear that while I support full prosecution, I'm also concerned about the broader implications. This incident represents a pattern of anti-military sentiment that seems to be growing in certain civilian populations. It might be worth investigating whether these individuals are part of a larger network of organized harassment." Agent Reeves nodded thoughtfully. Rachel's suggestion would expand the investigation beyond this single incident to examine whether Tyler's group was connected to broader anti-military movements. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that turned isolated incidents into comprehensive law enforcement operations. Tyler finally understood that his situation was spiraling completely beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd walked into Café Aurora that morning. What had started as casual harassment had become a federal investigation that would examine every aspect of his life and potentially expose any other illegal activities he'd been involved in. The three men who had thought they were intimidating a single female soldier were now facing the full investigative power of the federal government, triggered by their own recorded evidence and their refusal to accept reasonable resolution when it was offered. Agent Reeves closed her notebook and looked at Tyler, Tank, and Kevin with the expression of someone who had seen too many people destroy their lives through poor decisions. "Gentlemen, you're under arrest." The processing of Tyler, Tank, and Kevin into federal custody unfolded with the methodical precision that characterized all FBI operations. Agent Reeves coordinated with Agent Thompson to ensure that each suspect was properly Mirandized, photographed, and prepared for transport to the federal holding facility in downtown Riverside, 40 minutes away from Millbrook. As the handcuffs clicked around Tyler's wrists, the full weight of his situation finally penetrated his consciousness. The cold metal against his skin represented the end of his freedom and the beginning of a legal process that would consume months or years of his life. His earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a hollow understanding that his pride had cost him everything. "Tyler James Briggs, Agent," Thompson recited formally. "You are under arrest for destruction of federal property, conspiracy to commit hate crimes against military personnel, harassment of a federal officer, and making false statements to federal investigators. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Tank Rodriguez stood beside his friend, his own hands cuffed behind his back, experiencing the familiar sensation of being processed into custody. But this was different from his previous arrests for bar fights and domestic disputes. This was federal law enforcement, which meant federal prison, federal prosecutors, and a permanent criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. Kevin Morrison had stopped crying, his tears replaced by a numb shock that made him appear almost catatonic. The college student who had dreamed of creating viral content had succeeded beyond his wildest nightmares, but not in the way he'd intended. The video, on his phone, would indeed become evidence in a federal case, just not evidence that would advance his career prospects. Agent Kim approached Rachel and Master Chief Harrison as the suspects were being prepared for transport. "Commander Cross, we'll need you to provide a formal statement at our field office later today. We'll also need you to document any ongoing security concerns related to your clearance level and current assignments." Rachel nodded professionally. "Of course, Agent Kim. I should mention that I'm currently assigned to a classified training rotation that involves psychological operations techniques. These individuals now have knowledge of my identity and assignment location, which could present security implications." Agent Kim made notes about the security considerations, which would add another layer of federal investigation to examine whether the incident had compromised any ongoing operations. What Tyler had intended as simple harassment had potentially interfered with national security activities, elevating the charges even further. Master Chief Harrison stepped forward to address Agent Reeves directly. "Agent Reeves, there's something else you should know about this incident. Commander Cross represents a very small population of highly specialized military personnel. Targeting her specifically suggests either remarkable bad luck or deliberate intelligence gathering about military personnel in this area." Agent Reeves raised an eyebrow at the implication. "Are you suggesting this might have been more than random harassment?" "I'm suggesting that 3 civilians accidentally targeting one of the Navy's most specialized interrogators in a town with thousands of military personnel seems statistically unlikely," Harrison replied. "It might be worth investigating how they knew to be in this specific location at this specific time." Rachel considered Harrison's observation, her own analytical training recognizing the potential patterns he was identifying. Tyler's group had chosen Café Aurora, which was frequented by military personnel, but wasn't officially associated with any base. They had arrived during a time when she would normally be on duty. but had somehow known she would be there during her rare day off. Agent Thompson overheard the conversation and paused in his processing of the suspects. "Commander Cross, is your schedule predictable enough that someone could have been conducting surveillance?" "Negative," Rachel replied immediately. "My assignments are classified, and my personal time is deliberately irregular for security reasons. I chose this cafe randomly this morning because I saw it while driving through town." Agent Kim made additional notes about potential surveillance or intelligence gathering, which would expand the investigation to examine whether Tyler's group had connections to foreign intelligence services or domestic terrorism organizations interested in military personnel. Frank, who had been quietly observing the federal processing operation, approached Agent Reeves with information he'd been considering whether to share. "Agent Reeves, I don't know if this matters, but Tyler Briggs has been in here before. Several times over the past few weeks, always asking questions about military customers and their schedules." This revelation stopped all conversation. Agent Reeves immediately turned her full attention to Frank. "Mr. Kowalski, can you be more specific about these previous visits?" Frank thought carefully, understanding that his testimony could significantly impact the investigation's scope. "He came in maybe 4 or 5 times in the past month, always during different shifts. He would order coffee and then ask my staff casual questions about who the regular customers were, particularly anyone in uniform or who appeared military." Agent Thompson immediately pulled out his phone to request additional investigative resources. If Tyler had been conducting reconnaissance of military personnel, the incident transformed from random harassment into potential espionage or organized anti-military activity. Rachel felt a chill of professional concern as she realized the implications of Frank's revelation. Someone had been systematically gathering intelligence about military personnel's movements and habits, and she had inadvertently walked into what might have been a planned operation rather than a random encounter. "Agent Kim," Rachel said, her voice taking on the urgent tone she used during operational briefings. "If this was planned surveillance, we need to consider that other military personnel in this area might have been targeted as well. This could be part of a broader intelligence operation against Naval Special Operations personnel." Tyler, overhearing this conversation while being processed for transport, finally understood that his situation had escalated far beyond anything he'd imagined. What he'd thought was casual anti-military harassment was now being investigated as potential espionage, which carried sentences measured in decades rather than years. Agent Reeves made a decision that would reshape the entire investigation. "Agent Thompson, I want full background investigations on all 3 suspects, including financial records, communications intercepts, and association analysis. Agent Kim, coordinate with Naval Intelligence to determine if any other DEV-GRU personnel have been targeted in this area." Tank Rodriguez, whose military background gave him some understanding of intelligence operations, realized with growing horror that they were now suspected of being foreign agents or domestic terrorists. His dishonorable discharge from the Marines, combined with his financial difficulties and anti-military statements, would make him appear to be an ideal recruitment target for hostile intelligence services. Kevin Morrison's YouTube channel and social media presence would now be analyzed by federal investigators looking for evidence of coordination with anti-military groups or foreign influence operations. His dreams of film school were being replaced by the reality of counterintelligence investigation. Master Chief Harrison pulled Rachel aside as the suspects were being loaded into federal transport vehicles. "Rachel, you need to understand something. If this was planned surveillance of DevGru personnel, it represents a serious breach of operational security. Your current assignments might be compromised." Rachel nodded grimly, her mind already working through the security implications. If foreign intelligence services were targeting special operations personnel in civilian locations, it could compromise ongoing missions and put other operators at risk. Her decision to press federal charges had potentially uncovered a major security threat. Agent Reeves approached them both with the expression of someone whose quiet morning had just become a major federal investigation. "Commander Cross, Master Chief, Harrison, I'm going to need both of you to remain available for extended questioning. This incident may be part of something much larger than random harassment." As the federal vehicles departed with Tyler, Tank, and Kevin in custody, Café Aurora returned to an eerie quiet. But the investigation they had triggered was just beginning, and its implications would ripple through military and intelligence communities far beyond what any of them had anticipated. Rachel stood in the parking lot, watching the convoy disappear toward the federal facility, knowing that her quiet morning off had just become the opening move in what might be a major counterintelligence operation. The three men who had thought they were intimidating a female soldier had instead stumbled into one of the most dangerous people in the American military establishment. And now the full weight of federal law enforcement was beginning to uncover just how deep their mistake really went. The FBI field office in downtown Riverside buzzed with activity as Agent Reeves coordinated what had rapidly evolved from a simple harassment case into a potential counterintelligence operation. Within 2 hours of the arrests at Café Aurora, the investigation had expanded to include specialists from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and a liaison officer from Naval Special Warfare Command. Rachel found herself in interview room C, facing Agent Kim and Commander David Sterling, a naval intelligence officer who had been hastily summoned from the Pentagon when the security implications became clear. The sterile room with its recording equipment and fluorescent lighting felt familiar to Rachel, though she was more accustomed to being on the other side of such interrogations. "Commander Cross," Agent Kim began formally, "we need to reconstruct your movements over the past month to determine if you've been under surveillance. This isn't about your conduct, which was exemplary. This is about identifying potential threats to national security." Commander Sterling leaned forward, his expression grave. "Rachel, I've reviewed your current assignment status. Given your clearance level and recent operations, any compromise of your identity or location could have serious implications for ongoing missions. We need to know everything." Rachel understood the gravity of the situation. Her recent assignment had involved developing enhanced interrogation protocols for high-value terrorist targets. Work that was so classified it didn't officially exist in any Pentagon database. If foreign intelligence services had identified her and were conducting surveillance, it could compromise operations across multiple theaters. "I've varied my routine deliberately," Rachel began, her analytical mind reconstructing the past weeks. Different routes to and from base, random civilian activities, no predictable patterns. This morning was the first time I'd ever been to Café Aurora. Agent Kim made notes while reviewing a timeline that had been constructed from security camera footage, cell phone records, and financial transactions. "We've traced Tyler Briggs's movements over the past month. He visited at least 6 locations frequented by military personnel, always asking questions about regular customers and their schedules." Commander Sterling's jaw tightened. That's classic intelligence gathering. Someone was building a pattern analysis of military personnel movements in this area. The question is whether Briggs was working for someone else or if he stumbled into this on his own. In the holding cells downstairs, Tyler Briggs was beginning to understand that his situation had escalated far beyond simple harassment charges. The federal public defender assigned to his case, Attorney Janet Morrison, had just finished explaining that he was now suspected of espionage-related activities that could carry life sentences. "Tyler," Attorney Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many young men destroy their lives through poor decisions. "They're treating this as potential intelligence gathering against special operations personnel. That's not a misdemeanor harassment charge anymore. That's national security." Tyler's face had gone pale as the implications sank in. "I wasn't spying for anyone, I was looking for military people to mess with. I thought it would make good videos." "You need to understand something," Morrison continued. "The woman you targeted isn't just any Navy officer. She's part of a highly classified program that deals with the most dangerous terrorist threats our country faces. By conducting surveillance of her movements, you've potentially compromised national security operations. Back in the interview room, Rachel was working with Agent Kim to identify any other incidents that might be related to the surveillance pattern. Her training in pattern recognition and threat assessment made her uniquely qualified to analyze the intelligence-gathering operation she'd unknowingly been subjected to. There was one incident 3 weeks ago, Rachel recalled, her memory triggered by the systematic review. A maintenance worker at my apartment complex who seemed overly interested in my schedule. He asked the building manager about my work hours and travel patterns. Commander Sterling immediately made a note. We'll need to interview that individual and review all security camera footage from your building. If this is organized surveillance, there could be multiple operatives involved. Agent Kim pulled up additional files that had been compiled in the past 2 hours. We've also identified potential connections between Tyler Briggs and several online groups that promote harassment of military personnel. His social media activity shows coordination with at least 12 other individuals across 4 states. This revelation transformed the investigation from a local incident into a potential nationwide conspiracy. Rachel realized that her chance encounter at Café Aurora might have uncovered a broader network of anti-military surveillance and harassment that posed threats to special operations personnel across the country. Meanwhile, Tank Rodriguez was facing his own interrogation with Agent Thompson, who had specialized experience in breaking down suspects with military backgrounds. Tank's dishonorable discharge and financial difficulties made him appear to be a prime candidate for recruitment by hostile intelligence services. Rodriguez, Agent Thompson said, spreading Tank's financial records across the table. You've had significant cash deposits in your bank account over the past 2 months. These deposits don't correspond to any known employment. Where did this money come from? Tank stared at the records, his military training allowing him to understand the implications of what he was seeing. The cash deposits he'd received from Tyler for their harassment videos were being analyzed as potential payments from intelligence handlers. Tyler paid us for making the videos, Tank admitted, realizing that his honesty might be his only hope of avoiding espionage charges. He said he was building a social media following and would share the profits. Agent Thompson made notes, but his expression remained skeptical. Mr. Briggs was unemployed with no visible income. Where was he getting the money to pay you for these activities? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Tank realized he had no idea where Tyler had been getting the funds for their operations, and his inability to explain the financial arrangements made him appear even more like a foreign intelligence asset. Kevin Morrison was having his own crisis of understanding in Interview Room B, where Agent Sarah Chen was systematically dismantling his entire digital life. His YouTube channel, social media posts, and online communications were being analyzed by federal investigators who specialized in identifying foreign influence operations. Kevin, Agent Chen said, pulling up his YouTube analytics. Your channel had almost no viewers until 6 weeks ago, when you suddenly started getting significant traffic from overseas IP addresses. Can you explain this sudden international interest in your anti-military content? Kevin stared at the screen, watching his dreams of media success crumble as he realized that his sudden popularity might have been artificially generated by foreign intelligence services seeking to amplify anti-military sentiment in American social media. I thought I was just getting lucky with the algorithm, Kevin whispered, understanding that his online success had been a manipulation designed to encourage him to create more anti-military content. Back in Interview Room C, Rachel was beginning to understand the scope of what she'd stumbled into. Her decision to press federal charges against 3 harassing civilians had potentially uncovered a sophisticated intelligence operation targeting American Special Operations personnel. Commander Cross, Agent Kim said, reviewing the expanding file. Based on what we've discovered, we're recommending immediate security protocol changes for all DevGru personnel in this region. Your incident, may have prevented a much larger intelligence compromise. Commander Sterling nodded grimly. Rachel, you may have just prevented a major breach of Special Operations security. These individuals were collecting detailed intelligence about our personnel movements and habits. If they'd continued undetected. Rachel felt a chill as she realized how close the intelligence operation had come to success. Her random decision to visit Café Aurora and her refusal to be intimidated by 3 civilians had accidentally disrupted what appeared to be a systematic effort to compromise American Special Operations security. The investigation was expanding by the hour, with federal agents now examining similar incidents across the country to determine if Tyler's group was part of a larger network. What had started as simple harassment was revealing itself to be something far more dangerous to national security. The breakthrough in the investigation came at 3:47 p.m. when Agent Thompson's financial analysis team discovered something that transformed the entire scope of the case. Hidden within Tyler Briggs's bank records was a series of cryptocurrency transactions that had been converted to cash deposits over the past 3 months, totaling nearly $15,000. The transactions originated from accounts linked to a shell company registered in Eastern Europe. Agent Reeves burst into interview room C, where Rachel was still being debriefed by Commander Sterling and Agent Kim. "We need to talk. Now." Her expression carried the urgency of someone who had just uncovered something that went far beyond their initial assumptions. "Commander Cross, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels," Agent Reeves began, her voice dropping to the serious tone reserved for matters of national security. "The financial investigation has revealed that Tyler Briggs has been receiving payments from sources connected to Russian intelligence services. This wasn't random harassment. This was a coordinated intelligence operation, and you were the target." Rachel felt her blood run cold as the implications hit her. Russian intelligence services had identified her, tracked her movements, and deployed assets to gather information about her activities and vulnerabilities. The acid attack on her uniform hadn't been random harassment. It had been a psychological warfare operation designed to provoke a reaction that could be studied and analyzed. Commander Sterling immediately activated secure communication protocols to alert Naval Special Warfare Command. "Rachel, we need to assume your cover is completely blown. Every operation you've been involved in over the past year may be compromised. We're looking at a potential intelligence disaster." Agent Kim was already coordinating with counterintelligence specialists at multiple agencies. "Commander Cross, we believe the Russians were attempting to identify psychological pressure points that could be used against you in future operations. The harassment scenario was designed to test your responses and document your capabilities for their operational files." Rachel's analytical mind immediately began processing the tactical implications. If Russian intelligence had been studying her psychological responses, they might be planning to use that information against American prisoners or to compromise future interrogation operations. Her specialized techniques, which had been so effective against terrorist operatives, could be neutralized if the enemy understood her methods. In interview room A, Tyler Briggs was facing the collapse of his entire worldview as Agent Thompson presented him with evidence of his financial connections to Russian intelligence. The bank statements and cryptocurrency records spread across the table represented a paper trail that led directly to foreign espionage services. "Tyler," Agent Thompson said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "you're no longer just facing harassment charges. You're looking at espionage, treason, and conspiracy charges that carry potential death sentences. Your only hope of avoiding life in prison is complete cooperation with our investigation." Tyler stared at the financial records, his mind struggling to comprehend how his anti-military activism had evolved into working for Russian intelligence. "I never knew where the money was coming from," he whispered. "Someone contacted me online and said they wanted to support anti-establishment content creators. They just wanted videos showing military people being challenged." Agent Thompson leaned forward, recognizing the critical moment when A suspect's resistance collapsed under the weight of evidence. Who contacted you, Tyler? We need names, usernames, communication records, everything. Your life depends on your cooperation. Tank Rodriguez was experiencing his own moment of truth in interview room B as Agent Chen presented him with evidence that his recruitment had been part of a sophisticated psychological profile developed by foreign intelligence analysts. His dishonorable discharge, financial difficulties, and anti-military resentment had made him an ideal candidate for recruitment. Daniel, Agent Chen said, using his formal name to emphasize the gravity of the situation. Russian intelligence services identified you as someone who could be manipulated into targeting American military personnel. Your personal grievances against the military made you a perfect asset for their operations. Tank's military training allowed him to understand the implications immediately. He hadn't just been harassing random military personnel. He'd been systematically gathering intelligence for a hostile foreign power. The weight of his betrayal, even if unknowing, settled on him like a physical burden. Kevin Morrison's interrogation with Agent Williams had revealed that his YouTube channel and social media accounts had been systematically promoted by bot networks operated by Russian intelligence services. His anti-military content had been amplified and distributed to create the appearance of grassroots American opposition to military institutions. Kevin, Agent Williams explained, showing him analytics data that revealed the artificial nature of his online success. Your videos weren't going viral because of quality or relevance. They were being promoted by foreign intelligence services to create division and hatred toward American military personnel. You were being used as a propaganda asset. Kevin stared at the evidence of his manipulation. Understanding that his dreams of media success had been built on foreign intelligence operations designed to undermine American society. His ambitions had made him a tool for hostile powers seeking to weaken national security from within. Back in the main conference room, Rachel was participating in an emergency briefing with officials from multiple intelligence agencies who had been summoned to address the scope of the compromise. The room contained representatives from the CIA, DI, NSA, and Naval Intelligence, all focused on understanding how deeply Russian operations had penetrated American Special Operations security. Commander Cross, said Deputy Director James Harrison from the CIA's Counterintelligence Center. We believe this operation was specifically designed to target you because of your role in breaking several high-value Russian assets during recent interrogations. This appears to be retaliation for your professional successes. Rachel remembered the interrogations he was referring to. Russian intelligence operatives who had been attempting to recruit American military personnel for espionage operations. Her psychological techniques had been so effective that she'd convinced 3 separate Russian assets to reveal their entire networks, leading to the arrest of dozens of foreign agents. Sir, Rachel responded, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. If they've been studying my methods for months, we need to assume they've developed countermeasures for our entire interrogation program. Every technique I've used could be compromised. Agent Kim nodded grimly. That's exactly what we're afraid of. Your methods have been so successful that Russian intelligence apparently decided you represented a strategic threat that needed to be neutralized. The harassment operation was just the beginning. Commander Sterling reviewed classified files that had been rushed to the briefing room. Rachel, we've identified at least 12 other incidents across the country involving harassment of special operations personnel that follow similar patterns. This appears to be a nationwide intelligence operation targeting our most effective interrogators. The scope of the Russian operation was becoming clear. Tyler Briggs and his companions hadn't been random anti-military activists. They'd been carefully recruited and directed assets in a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to compromise American special operations capabilities through psychological warfare and intelligence gathering. Agent Reeves coordinated with federal prosecutors who were preparing charges that would reflect the true nature of the conspiracy. Tyler, Tank, and Kevin would face espionage charges that carried potential death sentences, while the investigation expanded to identify other cells operating across the country. Commander Cross, Agent Reeves said, her expression reflecting the seriousness of the situation. You need to understand that your decision to fight back this morning may have prevented a major intelligence breakthrough for Russian services. If they'd succeeded in documenting your psychological responses and breaking points, they could have used that information to compromise future operations. Rachel felt a complex mix of professional satisfaction and personal concern. Her refusal to be intimidated by 3 apparent civilians had accidentally disrupted a major foreign intelligence operation. But it had also revealed that she was a high-priority target for hostile powers who were willing to invest significant resources in neutralizing her effectiveness. The investigation was now a matter of national security, with implications that reached far beyond a simple harassment incident in a small-town coffee shop. The 3 men who had thought they were creating viral videos had instead become the key to unraveling a Russian intelligence operation that threatened American special operations security at the highest levels. The moment of decisive action came at 4:23 p.m., when Agent Reeves made the determination that Tyler Briggs represented an immediate flight risk and potential ongoing security threat. The evidence of Russian intelligence connections had elevated the case from domestic harassment to international espionage, requiring immediate intervention to prevent further intelligence compromise. We're moving to tactical arrest protocols, Agent Reeves announced to the assembled task force. Briggs still has active communication channels with his handlers, and we need to assume they're monitoring his status. If they realize their operation has been compromised, they'll activate contingency plans that could endanger other military personnel. Rachel found herself in the unique position of being both a victim and a critical intelligence asset in an unfolding counterintelligence operation. Her psychological expertise was now being deployed not against enemy combatants, but against American citizens who had been manipulated into serving foreign intelligence services. Commander Cross, said Deputy Director Harrison, we need you to participate in a controlled interrogation of Tyler Briggs. Your ability to break down psychological defenses could be crucial in identifying other Russian assets before they can escape or destroy evidence. Rachel nodded, understanding the tactical necessity despite the unusual nature of interrogating someone who had personally attacked her just hours earlier. Her professional training overrode any personal feelings about the incident, focusing instead on the national security implications of the Russian intelligence network. In the secure interrogation facility at the FBI field office, Tyler Briggs sat in a chair that had been occupied by terrorists, organized crime figures, and foreign intelligence operatives. The sterile room with its recording equipment and bulletproof observation windows represented the full weight of federal law enforcement focused on breaking down his resistance and extracting intelligence about Russian operations. Agent Thompson entered first, carrying files that contained evidence of Tyler's financial connections to Russian intelligence services. The paper trail of cryptocurrency transactions and shell company payments created an overwhelming case that Tyler's anti-military activities had been funded and directed by hostile foreign powers. Tyler, Agent Thompson began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years breaking down enemy agents. You have one opportunity to cooperate with this investigation and avoid treason charges that carry the death penalty. Your Russian handlers have abandoned you, and your only value to us now is the intelligence you can provide about their operations. Tyler's hands shook as he reviewed the financial evidence that documented his unwitting recruitment by Russian intelligence. The bank statements and communication records revealed a sophisticated operation that had identified his psychological vulnerabilities and systematically exploited them for intelligence-gathering purposes. I never knew they were Russian, Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper. They contacted me through social media and said they were American patriots who wanted to support anti-establishment activism. I thought I was fighting against military corruption, not working for foreign spies. Agent Thompson leaned forward, recognizing the moment when Tyler's resistance began to crumble under the weight of evidence. Tyler, Russian intelligence services spent months studying your background, your financial situation, your psychological profile, and your political beliefs. They knew exactly how to manipulate you into serving their interests. The door opened and Rachel entered, still wearing civilian clothes, but now carrying the authority of someone whose expertise was needed for national security. Tyler looked up at her with a mixture of fear and recognition, understanding that the woman he'd tried to humiliate was now in a position to determine his fate. "Mr. Briggs," Rachel said, her voice carrying the clinical tone she used in high-stakes interrogations, "you attacked me this morning because Russian intelligence services wanted to study my psychological responses under stress. You were being used to gather intelligence that could compromise American operations against terrorist targets." Tyler stared at Rachel, finally understanding the true scope of what he'd been involved in. "You're saying they used me to spy on you?" "I'm saying they used you to conduct psychological warfare against American Special Operations personnel," Rachel corrected. "Your harassment videos weren't anti-military activism. They were intelligence-gathering operations designed to identify vulnerabilities in our most effective interrogators." Agent Thompson spread additional documents across the table, showing Tyler communication records that revealed the systematic nature of his recruitment and direction by Russian handlers. "Tyler, these communications show detailed instructions about which military personnel to target, what questions to ask, and what specific behaviors to document." Tyler's worldview collapsed as he realized that every aspect of his anti-military activism had been choreographed by foreign intelligence services seeking to undermine American national security. His political beliefs, his financial motivations, and his personal grievances had all been exploited by professionals who understood exactly how to turn American citizens into unwitting intelligence assets. "The woman you attacked this morning," Agent Thompson continued, "has been responsible for breaking Russian intelligence networks that were attempting to recruit American military personnel. Your handlers identified her as a strategic threat that needed to be neutralized through psychological warfare." Rachel observed Tyler's stress responses with the analytical eye she'd developed through years of continuum interrogating enemy combatants. His micro-expressions, breathing patterns, and body language indicated someone experiencing complete cognitive dissonance as his self-image crumbled under the weight of reality. "Tyler," Rachel said, using the controlled empathy techniques that had proven so effective against terrorist operatives, "you believe yourself to be a patriotic American who was fighting against military corruption. The psychological profile your Russian handlers developed exploited that self-image to turn you into an intelligence asset against your own country." Tyler's eyes filled with tears as he understood the depth of his aftermath. Betrayal, even if it had been unknowing. "What happens to me now?" Agent Thompson consulted his files before responding. "That depends entirely on your cooperation with this investigation. We need complete information about your Russian contacts, communication methods, financial arrangements, and any other individuals who were recruited through the same." Rachel leaned forward, applying the psychological pressure that had broken enemy agents in classified facilities around the world. "Tyler, right now you have the opportunity to partially redeem yourself by helping us stop an intelligence operation that threatens American military personnel. Your cooperation could save lives and prevent future attacks." The interrogation continued for 3 hours as Tyler provided detailed information about his recruitment, training, and direction by handlers he'd believed were American patriots. His confession revealed a sophisticated Russian intelligence operation that had recruited dozens of American civilians to conduct surveillance and psychological warfare against military targets. Tank Rodriguez and Kevin Morrison underwent similar interrogations, their own confessions adding pieces to a puzzle that revealed the scope and sophistication of Russian intelligence penetration of American society. All 3 men had been carefully selected, and manipulated based on psychological profiles that identified their specific vulnerabilities. By 8 p.m., the FBI had enough information to begin rolling up the entire Russian intelligence network, with arrest warrants being prepared for handler operatives and other recruited assets across multiple states. The investigation that had begun with harassment in a coffee shop had uncovered one of the most significant counterintelligence successes in recent years. Rachel stood in the observation room, watching Tyler complete his confession to federal investigators. The man who had attacked her with acid that morning was now providing intelligence that would protect other military personnel from similar operations. Her decision to fight back rather than submit to intimidation had accidentally triggered the exposure of a major threat to national security. Agent Reeves joined her at the observation window. "Commander Cross, your actions today prevented what could have been a catastrophic intelligence compromise. If this operation had continued undetected, Russian services could have developed psychological warfare capabilities against our entire special operations community." Rachel nodded, understanding that her chance encounter with 3 apparent civilians had become a defining moment in the ongoing intelligence war between America and its adversaries. The acid that had destroyed her uniform had also dissolved the cover of a sophisticated enemy operation. The aftermath of Tyler's confession sent shockwaves through multiple intelligence agencies as the true scope of the Russian operation became clear. Within 6 hours of his detailed debriefing, federal agents were executing simultaneous raids across 7 states, targeting safe houses, communication centers, and other assets that had been identified through the intelligence Tyler, Tank, and Kevin had provided. At the FBI's Strategic Intelligence Division in Washington, D.C., Deputy Director Patricia Wells convened an emergency briefing for senior officials from across the intelligence community. The conference room filled with representatives from the CIA, NSA, DIA, and Naval Intelligence, all focused on understanding how Russian services had penetrated so deeply into American society without detection. "The operation we've uncovered represents a fundamental shift in how hostile intelligence services are targeting American military capabilities," Deputy Director Wells began, addressing the assembled officials. Rather than traditional espionage focused on stealing classified documents, the Russians were conducting systematic psychological warfare against our most effective special operations personnel. Rachel found herself at the center of this high-level briefing, her expertise in psychological operations making her uniquely qualified to analyze the Russian methodology. Sitting at a conference table surrounded by some of the most senior intelligence officials in the American government, she provided tactical analysis of how the enemy had attempted to compromise her effectiveness. "The harassment scenario was designed to document my stress responses, decision-making patterns, and psychological breaking points," Rachel explained to the assembled officials. If they'd succeeded in completing their analysis, they could have developed countermeasures against interrogation techniques that have been crucial to our counter-terrorism operations. Admiral James Patterson, commander of Naval Special Warfare, reviewed classified files that detailed Rachel's recent successes against enemy operatives. "Commander Cross has been responsible for breaking 17 high-value targets in the past 18 months, including Russian intelligence assets attempting to recruit American military personnel. Her psychological techniques have been so effective that apparently Moscow decided she represented a strategic threat." Director Sarah Chen, from the CIA's Russia division, provided additional context about the scope of the operation. "Based on the intelligence we've gathered from the 3 arrested individuals, we believe the Russians have been running similar operations against at least 40 other special operations personnel across the country. Commander Cross was just one target in a much larger intelligence campaign." The implications were staggering. If Russian intelligence had succeeded in psychologically profiling America's most effective interrogators, they could have developed comprehensive countermeasures that would neutralize years of tactical advantages in the intelligence war against terrorism and hostile foreign powers. Meanwhile, in federal holding facilities across the country, Other American citizens who had been unknowingly recruited by Russian intelligence were facing their own moments of truth. The network that Tyler had helped expose included college students, military veterans, unemployed civilians, and political activists, all carefully selected and manipulated based on psychological profiles that identified their specific vulnerabilities. Agent Reeves coordinated the nationwide roundup from the FBI's command center in Riverside, watching as real-time intelligence from Tyler's confession led to the arrest of Russian handler operatives who had been living under deep cover in American communities for years. The investigation had evolved into one of the most significant counterintelligence successes since the end of the Cold War. "Commander Cross," Agent Reeves said, approaching Rachel during a brief break in the briefings, "you should know that your decision to fight back this morning has led to the arrest of 12 Russian intelligence operatives and the exposure of a network that threatened our entire special operations community. Your refusal to be intimidated may have prevented a catastrophic intelligence compromise." Rachel absorbed this information with the professional detachment she'd developed through years of high-stakes operations. But she also felt the weight of how close the enemy had come to achieving their objectives. If she'd chosen to simply walk away from the harassment at Café Aurora, the Russian intelligence operation could have continued undetected for months or years. Tyler Briggs, now in federal protective custody, after providing complete cooperation with the investigation, was facing a complex legal future. His attorney, Janet Morrison, had negotiated a plea agreement that would reduce his charges in exchange for continued cooperation with ongoing counterintelligence operations. Instead of facing potential execution for treason, Tyler would serve 15 years in federal prison, while helping investigators identify other Russian recruitment networks. Tank Rodriguez had also accepted a plea agreement, his military background making his cooperation particularly valuable in understanding how Russian services targeted disaffected veterans for recruitment. His detailed confession revealed sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that had been used to turn his legitimate grievances against military bureaucracy into active cooperation with foreign intelligence. Kevin Morrison's case presented unique challenges because his YouTube channel and social media presence had been so thoroughly compromised by Russian bot networks and artificial promotion. Federal prosecutors were struggling to determine how much of his anti-military content reflected his genuine beliefs versus foreign manipulation, but his cooperation with the investigation had earned him consideration for reduced charges. The 3 men who had walked into Café Aurora that morning, planning to create viral harassment videos, were now key witnesses in a counterintelligence operation that would reshape American understanding of Russian intelligence capabilities. Their willingness to cooperate fully with federal investigators had transformed them from enemy assets into valuable intelligence sources. At Naval Special Warfare Command in Virginia Beach, Admiral Patterson was briefing senior officers about the security implications of the Russian operation and the changes that would be implemented to protect special operations personnel from similar intelligence gathering attempts. Effective immediately, Admiral Patterson announced to the assembled SEAL and Special Operations commanders, "All personnel with psychological operations specializations will be assigned enhanced security protocols. The Russians have demonstrated their willingness to target our most effective interrogators, and we must assume they will continue these efforts." Rachel's role in exposing the intelligence operation had earned her recognition at the highest levels of the military and intelligence communities, but it had also made her an even higher priority target for foreign services seeking to compromise American capabilities. Her effectiveness as an interrogator was now balanced against the security risks created by her exposure to enemy intelligence operations. The investigation continued to expand as federal agents followed intelligence leads that stretched across multiple continents. The Russian operation targeting American special operations personnel was apparently part of a broader campaign that included similar efforts against British SAS operatives, French special forces, and other allied military units. Agent Kim approached Rachel, as the briefings concluded for the day. "Commander Cross, there's something else you should know. The Russian intelligence service that was targeting you has been linked to several terrorist organizations that have been planning attacks against American interests. Your interrogation successes apparently convinced Moscow that you represented a strategic threat to their proxy operations." Rachel understood the implications immediately. Her psychological techniques hadn't just been effective against individual enemy operatives. They'd been so successful that they disrupted entire intelligence networks and terrorist cells that Russian services had spent years developing. The harassment at Café Aurora had been retaliation for her professional effectiveness on a global scale. As the day ended, Rachel found herself reflecting on how a simple decision to get coffee on her day off had uncovered one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations targeting American military personnel. Her refusal to be intimidated by 3 apparent civilians had accidentally triggered the exposure of a threat that could have compromised national security for years. The investigation was far from over, with federal agents continuing to follow leads that reached into the highest levels of Russian intelligence services. But the immediate threat had been neutralized, and the American Special Operations community was now better protected against future psychological warfare campaigns designed to compromise their most effective personnel. 6 months after the incident at Café Aurora, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Cross stood at the podium of the National Defense University's auditorium, addressing an audience of military intelligence professionals, FBI counterintelligence specialists, and allied intelligence officers from 12 different countries. The lecture hall was packed beyond capacity, with additional attendees watching via secure video link from classified facilities around the world. The woman who had simply wanted coffee on her day off had become the face of a new era in counterintelligence awareness. Her experience had fundamentally changed how American and allied intelligence services understood the evolving threats posed by sophisticated psychological warfare campaigns targeting special operations personnel. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rachel began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from having faced down both enemy operatives and Russian intelligence assets. "What happened in Millbrook 6 months ago represents a paradigm shift in how hostile intelligence services are targeting our most effective military personnel. This was not traditional espionage. It was psychological warfare designed to compromise our operational capabilities from within." In the audience, Agent Reeves sat alongside Master Chief Harrison, both now part of a joint FBI military task force dedicated to identifying and countering foreign intelligence operations targeting American special operations. The investigation they had initiated had grown into a permanent counterintelligence program that protected military personnel across all branches of service. The Russian operation we uncovered had been active for over 2 years. Rachel continued, displaying classified intelligence on the presentation screen. They had identified and targeted 43 special operations personnel, including interrogators, psychological operations specialists, and tactical intelligence analysts. The goal was not to steal classified information, but to develop psychological profiles that could be used to neutralize our most effective human intelligence capabilities. Rachel's presentation included case studies from the broader investigation, showing how Russian intelligence had used sophisticated psychological manipulation to recruit American citizens as unwitting assets. The techniques were so effective that most targets never realized they were being directed by foreign intelligence services. Tyler Briggs, now 18 months into his federal prison sentence, had become an unlikely expert on Russian recruitment techniques through his continued cooperation with counterintelligence investigations. His detailed knowledge of how he'd been manipulated had helped federal agents identify and counter similar operations across multiple states. Tank Rodriguez had been released after serving 8 months in federal prison, his military background and full cooperation earning him consideration for early release. He now worked with the Department of Veterans Affairs, helping to identify other former military personnel who might be vulnerable to foreign recruitment due to financial difficulties or unresolved grievances against military bureaucracy. Kevin Morrison had received the lightest sentence due to his age and the extent of his manipulation by Russian bot networks. He now studied cybersecurity at a community college while working part-time for the FBI's social media analysis unit, using his experience with artificial online promotion to help identify foreign influence operations targeting American social media platforms. The three individuals who attacked me that morning, Rachel explained to the audience, were not evil people. They were American citizens whose legitimate concerns about political and military issues were identified and exploited by professional intelligence operatives. This represents a new model of espionage that turns our own citizens into intelligence assets without their knowledge or consent. Admiral Patterson, now serving as Director of Special Operations Security, provided additional context about the institutional changes that had resulted from Rachel's investigation. Enhanced security protocols now protected all special operations personnel with sensitive assignments, while new training programs taught military personnel to recognize and report potential intelligence gathering attempts. Commander Cross's decision to fight back rather than submit to intimidation prevented what could have been one of the most successful intelligence operations against American special operations in our history. Admiral, Patterson told the audience, her refusal to be a victim accidentally triggered the exposure of a threat that we didn't even know existed. The investigation had revealed that similar Russian operations were targeting special operations personnel throughout NATO, with parallel cases identified in the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and 12 other allied nations. Rachel's experience had sparked an international counterintelligence cooperation program that shared information about foreign psychological warfare campaigns targeting military personnel. Agent Kim, now heading the FBI's Military Personnel Protection Unit, provided statistics about the ongoing investigation. We've identified and arrested 67 Russian intelligence operatives and their recruited assets across 15 countries. The network that targeted Commander Cross was part of a global campaign that represented the most sophisticated peacetime intelligence operation since the Cold War. Rachel's personal transformation from victim to counterintelligence expert had also earned her recognition far beyond the military community. She had been promoted to commander and assigned to lead a new joint Pentagon-CIA program developing countermeasures against foreign psychological warfare operations. Her unique combination of interrogation expertise and personal experience with enemy intelligence made her ideally suited to protect other military personnel from similar attacks. The most important lesson from this experience, Rachel concluded her presentation, is that our enemies have evolved beyond traditional espionage models. They're now using our own citizens, our own social media platforms, and our own political divisions as weapons against our national security. Defense against these threats requires not just better intelligence gathering, but better understanding of how psychological manipulation can turn patriotic Americans into unwitting intelligence assets. The audience responded with sustained applause, recognizing both Rachel's professional expertise and her personal courage in transforming a traumatic attack into a learning opportunity that would protect countless other military personnel. After the presentation, Rachel was approached by Colonel Maria Santos, a special operations officer from the Spanish military who had traveled to Washington specifically to learn about the Russian intelligence methods that had been uncovered. Commander Cross, Colonel Santos said, "We've identified similar incidents targeting our own special operations personnel. Your experience has helped us understand that what we thought were random harassment incidents were actually coordinated intelligence operations. You may have saved lives in my country as well." This international dimension of the impact made Rachel realize that her morning at Café Aurora had had consequences far beyond anything she could have imagined. The three men who had thrown acid on her uniform had accidentally triggered an investigation that protected military personnel across multiple continents. Later that evening, Rachel received a phone call from Tyler Briggs, who was permitted to make monthly calls to her as part of his ongoing cooperation with federal investigators. These conversations had evolved from hostile confrontation to something approaching mutual respect, as both understood how they'd been manipulated by forces beyond their control. "Commander Cross," Tyler said, his voice carrying the humility that 18 months of federal prison had taught him. "I wanted you to know that they're transferring me to a minimum security facility next month. The warden says I've been a model prisoner and that my cooperation with the investigation has been valuable." Rachel felt a complex mix of emotions about Tyler's rehabilitation. The man who had attacked her with acid had genuinely transformed himself through understanding how he'd been manipulated by foreign intelligence. His journey from unwitting enemy asset to valuable counterintelligence source represented the possibility of redemption even from the most serious betrayals. "Tyler," Rachel replied, "I hope you continue to help other people understand how they can be manipulated by hostile forces. Your experience can protect other Americans from making the same mistakes." As Rachel ended the call, she reflected on how the investigation had changed, not just her own life, but the lives of everyone involved. Tyler, Tank, and Kevin had paid a heavy price for their unwitting cooperation with Russian intelligence, but their willingness to fully cooperate with federal investigators had helped protect countless other Americans from similar manipulation. The investigation continued even now, with federal agents following leads that stretched across multiple continents and decades of Russian intelligence operations. But the immediate threat had been neutralized, and the American Special Operations community was now better protected against future psychological warfare campaigns. Rachel looked out the window of her new office at the Pentagon, watching military personnel go about their duties with enhanced security protocols that had resulted from her experience. Her chance encounter with 3 hostile civilians at Café Aurora had become a defining moment in the ongoing intelligence war between America and its adversaries, proving that sometimes the most important battles were won not through military force, but through the courage to refuse intimidation when it mattered most. The woman who had simply wanted coffee on her day off had become a guardian of American national security, her story serving as both a warning about foreign intelligence threats and an inspiration about the power of individual courage to protect democratic institutions. Her legacy would continue to protect military personnel for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.